My name is Nancy Roberts, and I'm an economics professor at Arizona State University. Today's topic is the importance of elasticity when we start talking about taxation. And so what we want to do is look at the incidence of a tax when elasticity is different. So there's two kinds of incidence of taxation that we need to talk about. One is called the statutory incidence. So for example, if you go to the store and buy something and you have to pay 6% tax on it, the collector of the tax is the store. In other words, they have the statutory incidence. They collect the tax and they pay it to the government. They pay what they've collected. They're the collection agent for the government. The other incidence that we want to talk about is the economic incidence, and that is who actually bears the burden of this taxation. So a lot of people think that if you tax a producer a certain amount, $1 per unit, if the government says to the producer you have to pay $1 per unit tax on whatever it is you produce, people think the producer will pass that dollar tax completely on to the consumer. Well, that's incorrect. And so what we want to do today is see how important elasticity is in determining who actually bears the burden of a tax. And so what I want to do is draw two different scenarios. One scenario is where the demand for this good is relatively inelastic. So there's demand, there's supply, here's the price, and here's the quantity. I'll call them P1 and Q1. And over here, I want to draw a good where the demand is relatively elastic. And here's the price, here's the quantity. Now, if both of these goods are going to be taxed, let's just assume it's an excise tax, which means it's a certain percentage of both of them. So 7%. Then if we tax the supplier has to collect this tax and give it to the government, so the supplier's costs have just gone up. So let's increase, let's say this is the supply curve with the tax in it, because we're going to make this supplier give the government the tax. Let's do the same thing over here. Supplier has to pay the tax. Now, what I want you to notice is, in both cases, the price to the consumer is going to increase. The equilibrium price goes from here, E1, to here, E2. From here, E1, to here, E2. New price, P2. New price, P2. New quantity, Q2. New quantity, Q2. But the amount of the tax is the shift in the supply curve. So the amount of the tax is this amount right here. I'll call it T, the amount of the tax. Here's the amount of the tax. T, that amount right there. So if you will look, this amount right here, I'll call this P hat. This amount right here is the tax. It's a parallel shift. That's the tax. This amount right here, I'll call this P hat. This is the tax, right? Now, as you can see, if you want to know what the consumer's share is and you want to know what the producer's share is, then what you have to do is figure out, number one, what was the price increase for the consumer? Well, in this model right here, where the demand is relatively inelastic, the price went up from P1 to P2. So this amount right here, Q2 units of these are going to be sold at a price of P2. The price used to be P1, so the consumer is paying this much. But look at this area right here, which I will make in blue. This is the producer's share, because the producer is going to collect a price of P2, but he's going to have to turn around and give the government, P2 minus P1 on Q2 units. So here's all of the tax revenue that's collected. This much of it was borne by the consumer. This much was borne by the producer. So in this case, the consumer bore the brunt of this tax. Let's look over here. Price increase from P1 to P2. So the consumer paid that. The producer collects P2, but he has to give the government the difference between P2 and P hat on Q2 units. So the producer paid that much. And what you can see is that if demand is relatively inelastic, the incidence of the tax is borne more by the consumer than the producer. If the demand for the good is relatively elastic, then the incidence of the tax is borne by the producer more than by the consumer. The only way the consumer would bear the entire burden is if the demand were perfectly inelastic, which we can't come up with an example of that. So taxation is important. If the government's trying to collect a lot of tax revenue, one thing you'll notice is if demand is inelastic, the quantity demanded is not going to decrease very much. If the demand is relatively elastic, the quantity demanded is going to decrease a lot. And this determines who bears the burden. So taxation, elasticity is an important issue in the problem of taxation. And that concludes our elasticity lectures.